Hello, and welcome to Indiana Issues, the weekly public affairs program where we try to go beyond the headlines and sound bites and bring you Indiana's newsmakers in their entirety. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Today on Indiana Issues, the state of Indiana closed out the fiscal year with a surplus, and what's going on with the political news cycle these days. We'll discuss. Indiana Issues is underwritten in part by the Indiana Conference of Mayors and Trust Local Program, the Indiana Chamber of Commerce, the Small Business Law Firm of Thrasher, Bushman & Vocal, the Institute for Quality Education, the Indiana Civil Rights Commission, and Downtown Comics, your place to escape. You're listening to Indiana Issues.
I'm a single woman with a full-time job and a high credit score, but was recently turned down for a loan.
I was denied a promotion where I work because of a previous injury.
I couldn't get into the grocery store because the entrance was not wheelchair accessible.
The Indiana Civil Rights Commission reminds you that discrimination still happens. If you feel that you have been the victim of discrimination, call the Indiana Civil Rights Commission at 1-866-332-4748 or visit our website at in.gov/ICRC. This message is brought to you by the State of Indiana Civil Rights Commission.
Welcome back to Indiana Issues. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Well, the state of Indiana closed out the 2024 fiscal year with nearly $2.6 billion in cash reserves, $2.55 billion to be exact. The state's attributes the increase to mostly sales income taxes. Here's that announcement.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Elise Nishala, Indiana State Comptroller, and I am joined by Chris Johnston, Director of the Office of Budget and Management, and Joe Habig, Acting Director for the State Budget Agency. We are here to announce that the state of Indiana, at fiscal year-end close of 2024, has a cash reserve of $2.551 billion. Thanks to our long-standing conservative stewardship of maintaining a healthy cash reserve between 10 and 15%, Indiana closed out this fiscal year, 2024, at 11%. The nearly $2.6 billion is a combined total from the following funds: General, Medicaid contingency and reserve, tuition reserve, and rainy day. We experienced a slight increase in income and a solid return on investments, further supporting our strong financial position. Our healthy amount of cash reserves and our standing as the 7th lowest debt per capita state in the nation showcases our high level of fiscal responsibility that stands as a bright light, especially during this time where we are facing a national debt crisis. As a leading financial officer for our state, I see the nearly $35 trillion in federal debt as the largest threat to Indiana's robust economy. Our due diligence here at home is essential, and our books, closing them entails a process that takes us months to prepare for and weeks to complete. And I want to thank my staff and the staff of O&B and the staff of the Budget Agency for your hours and hours of review, ensuring the accuracy of our year-end report. Come the first of this new year, I look forward to bringing you Indiana's audited annual comprehensive financial report, which will offer additional information on all state expenditures, cash flow, federal grants, and debt administration. And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us and turn it over to Chris Johnston.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. As Comptroller Nishala said, I'm Chris Johnston from the Office of Management and Budget. Thank you, and welcome to the first of these for you. I also want to thank the staff of the Comptroller's office. As I've mentioned before, this is quite an undertaking to close the state's books. It probably only gets more complicated every year, so there's a great, tremendous effort that goes into that. It's really an inter-office and a cross-agency effort to close the books with the State Budget Agency, as the Comptroller recognized. I'd also like to welcome Joe Habig. Joe has been a standout budget official with the Budget Agency for some time, and he's continued that in his new role as Acting Budget Director. Finally, with all these thank yous, I also want to thank the Revenue Technical Forecasting Committee, who's done a great job, and you'll hear the amount or the great work that they've done. Unlike prior years where we've tried to bundle both the revenue forecast or the revenue report for the month of June and also for the fiscal year along with this fiscal closeout availability, schedules didn't permit that, so we're holding the closeout today. We went ahead and issued the revenue report on July 12th. I will still spend a little time reviewing the fiscal year 24 revenues, both against forecast and comparing to last year. Then I'll turn things over to Joe to walk through the surplus statement and combined statements, which will give a snapshot of the midpoint of our current biennium, and also a look at the second year, fiscal year 25. Of course, that's just a peek as of July 23rd, as there will be an updated forecast come December for the prior to the next legislative session, the primary task of which will be to develop and adopt the next budget. What I hope you take away from our remarks and the data that we've provided today is that Indiana continues its commitment to fiscal stability and sound financial management, spending less than we take in, and maintaining ample reserves to continue funding critical services to Hoosiers if we're ever confronted with any economic stress or shocks. So total revenues landed right on the December forecast. For the second year in a row, our total revenues were collected were less than 0.1% off of that forecast. So again, great work by the technical committee. It was up 2% compared to fiscal year 23. But within those buckets, those revenue streams, there was some unevenness by tax type to get to that accurate revenue forecast. Just a little reminder for all of us about our big contributors to our revenues. Sales tax generates about 50% of all general fund revenues. Individual income tax represents another 37%, so collectively between the two of them, we're right about 85% of total revenues are generated from sales tax and individual income tax. Corporate income tax is another 5%, and then the remainder is made up of various miscellaneous taxes. Sales tax was off just under 1%. Individual income tax was just up over 1%. So essentially those two, both in percentages and dollar amounts, canceled each other out. Corporate income tax missed its target by 16%, or almost $180 million. Now, corporate income tax is the most difficult tax type to predict. There is tax planning and financial planning that we just can't get to put ourselves in the heads of all the CFOs around the state of Indiana. And so that has been going on as far as their management of their operations. Also, it can be influenced by very large taxpayers. And so not only from the manufacturers and small businesses that pay this tax, but also financial institutions tax. So it is difficult to pinpoint, and we've seen those variances over the years. But to make up for the or an offsetting factor to that $180 million variance, interest earnings were up almost $180 million. And so when you total all of those back and forth, we land right at just missing target by $14 million. So again, I really want to commend the revenue forecasting team, and particularly after the last several years. Those of you who have been covering this for some time, you'll probably find the revenue report and the closeout statement rather boring because we're sort of landing back into our traditional patterns, unlike what we experienced during the pandemic, as well as what happened coming out of the pandemic. So now I'd like to turn it over to Joe to walk through the expenditure side of this, to marry it with the revenues, and where did we land with our financial statements.
All right, good afternoon. I am Joe Hayvig. I'm the acting director of the State Budget Agency, and I want to thank Director Johnson and Comptroller Nishala. Thanks for the words. And our offices do work extremely closely throughout the entire year, but especially during closing out a fiscal year and then opening a new one. So it truly is a joint effort between budget, the OMB affiliated agencies, and the Comptroller's office and the Treasurer's office. So in addition to working to ensure that we close the year accurately and we account for it, that budget ledgers are reconciled with general ledger, we also ensure that we're meeting the governor's fiscal policy goals. And so in Indiana, as has been said before, we've developed not just a track record of good fiscal stewardship and prudent budget writing, but now it's really culturally ingrained. We've got decades now of historical results to back that up. And so the results of fiscal year 2024 are really indicative of the value that comes from budgeting recurring appropriations at levels less than forecasted revenue. So that common sense discipline ensured that Indiana was able to maintain a $421.4 million annual surplus and total combined balances in our general fund reserves at $2.55 billion. So that's a balance that's well within our 10 to 12% range of expenditures that we typically target. And so with the various services that Hoosiers expect from us and state government to provide, our vision is to ensure that Indiana's priorities are funded not just today, but also tomorrow. And in order to do that, continued fiscal discipline and budget writing and budget management will ensure that sustainability of service provision, not just today, but also into the future. So I'll go through, we have several statements on the budget agency's website that are publicly available, and I'll go through some of these now. The one that's most referenced with fiscal year closeout is our surplus statement. And so I'll highlight a few points in the surplus statement. For FY24, our total current year revenues were $21,911.6 million. That is a 1.5% growth over the prior year. And so that includes not only forecasted revenues, but also the miscellaneous unforecasted revenues. Current year expenditures were less than that. They were $21,490.2 million. And that resulted in that $421.4 million annual surplus. Below the line, we had other uses of our cash reserves, and so we had appropriations for line item capital projects from the budget bill, in addition to various other revenues, interest earnings in our reserve accounts that resulted in our combined balances landing at $2.55 billion. So that does result in a balance of 11.9% of our current year expenditure levels. So well within that 10 to 12% that we target. With that, some of the other statements that you'll find on our website are also a combined reserve statement that will break out that combined balance into the various different reserve accounts. So we landed with $665.1 million in the general fund, $181 million in the Medicaid contingency and reserve account, $672.3 million in the state tuition reserve account, and our rainy day fund, or the most commonly referred to as a rainy day fund, it landed at $1,032.8 million. So that is how you come up to the $2.551 billion in reserves. We have notes to the statements on our website in addition to reversion reports. So if you have any questions or you want more information on which funds and which agencies had reversions back to the general fund, you can reference all those on our website. And with that, I'll take any questions you might have.
Obviously, it's always good to say that's extra money. One of the big criticisms has always been that the state's maybe taking too much of the taxpayers' money, new government spending the programs. How do you respond to all that?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, our General Assembly has worked to reduce taxes, and so income tax rates are coming down, and they're scheduled to continue to come down. We've done a series of automatic taxpayer refunds to ensure that when we do, and we have during the pandemic, we were collecting revenue levels that far exceeded appropriation levels, and so we returned that to the taxpayer. The other thing, too, is that we've ensured that the use of the large balances that we saw the last couple of years are put towards very strategic things, paying down our pre-1996 Teachers Retirement Fund and the liability on that, investing in one-time needed capital expenditures at state-owned facilities. So I think all of that in combination with lowering debt by paying off some of our debt service is how we've tried to wisely make sure we're not collecting too much.
Can you explain the difference between the projected Medicaid shortfall that we're working with right now and the numbers that we could see in the December forecast?
Yeah, so the Medicaid, and I should have noted that on here. So with Medicaid, the last Medicaid forecast was in the December 2023 Budget Committee. And so at that time, you might recall that it had forecasted a shortfall between appropriation and estimated expenditures of $255.2 million in FY24. And so the budget agency, working with FSSA, has augmented the Medicaid budget by that amount. We will discover probably in the next month where we actually land for fiscal year 24 with Medicaid expenditures, and if it was close to that 255.2, we have no reason to think it's not going to be. And then there will be an updated Medicaid forecast in December, along with a new revenue forecast in December of 2024. That will give us further indication going into a budget session what the Medicaid needs will be next.
Since we no longer are subject to a lot of pandemic-related pressures, as we mentioned just now, what sort of clarity does that provide you for budget planning broadly and specifically as it pertains to the Medicaid shortfall?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think a couple of things. I mean, one, during the pandemic, there was enhanced federal matching amounts that have since expired. There was a prohibition on disenrollment, regardless of whether the individual was truly eligible for Medicaid or not. And so with that behind us, since we kind of returned to normal, we can, I think, have a better, clear picture on what the true trends in the future might look for Medicaid program.
Joe, I want to ask about conversions. I know the biggest chunk of that one half is tuition support.
Yes.
Do you happen to know why the Treasurer's Office spent back more than half of the budget?
Yeah, so you're probably referencing the career scholarship accounts and the education scholarship accounts. These are relatively new programs, and I think there's just a ramp up as more folks become familiar with the program, the available options they have there. It will pick up. We reverted similar amounts, actually more last fiscal year. So the expenditures and the use of those career scholarship accounts and education scholarship accounts is increasing. I think it's just we're on a ramp up phase right now.
With both the slowdown in major tax revenues, actually 3% less than what the budget was written on in that forecast, and how much the surplus has gone down, what you projected even a year ago. How much does that constrain the state, do you think, going forward? Is that a worry going into future budgets that it's going to be tough to do new programs or fund education? Is that handicap the state going forward?
As I've said in previous years in this setting, I worry a lot about a lot of things, so that I always keep an eye on the revenues. But I think what Joe had mentioned, there's the fact that we have this discipline now to drive towards an annual surplus. That at least in our planning, we look at what the forecasted revenues are and we plan a budget that leave very generous surpluses for the 2 fiscal years that we budget for. And then these reserves, which are still at the 10 to 12% range, I think give us the confidence that we'll still be able to deliver on the services. Now, I will say, I think the December forecast will be interesting. Because as you mentioned, the revenues grew by 2% this year over last year. Next year's forecast, though, right now, from December of 2023, grows that by 3.8%. So almost twice as much as what we saw this year. So again, I think that's going to be something that gets looked at. Again, we've been waiting for this severe recession, right, for the last couple of years, and it hasn't really happened. So we'll see what happens. People are looking a lot at interest rates and consumer spending. So I'm confident going into the next budget session And I think we've got all the tools set up to continue that fiscal discipline that Joe referenced.
The sales tax, like you referenced, half the revenue being down a percentage point a year ago. Is that, with the tax rate, the income tax cuts and everything, making the state more dependent on that sales taxes, how big a factor is that going to be going forward?
Well, I think sales tax, like you said, almost 50% of the revenues towards the general fund, and consumer spending is a big component of the state's economy, of the national economy. So looking at the pressures that might be on that as far as household debt, interest rates, obviously those are going to be some stressors that are put on consumer spending. But one of the things I would like to note from the comparison to 2023 is there's about, I think it's around $140 million of gasoline use tax that didn't get directed to the general fund as it had been in the past. And so that's a big component of, as far as the variance from the prior year.
How much, just so I'm clear, has the surplus dropped compared to before? Like where are we at now?
So
the previous years.
You mean the total reserves, the combined reserves?
I can speak to that. So, we started FY24 at 2.926 billion, and then we're finishing with 2.551. And when the budget passed in a year and 3 or 4 months ago, it was assumed at that time that we would finish with combined balances around 2.6 billion at the end of the year. So we're just a little south of that, but.
Going back to the Medicaid question for a minute, how are the numbers in this report driving conversations between FSSA and all your various agencies?
How are you driving the conversations? There's a lot of conversations. FSSA, when the revised Medicaid forecast came out in December, immediately went to work at looking at how can we improve not only the forecasting, how can we improve the monthly reporting to see what is actually trending inside the fiscal year, but then also looking at their programs and seeing where efficiencies could be achieved, but also delivering those core services that Hoosiers expect. So the conversations have been ongoing, and they'll continue going right into the next budget session. And as I think we mentioned, in addition to a revenue forecast, there will be a new Medicaid forecast in December.
Chris, how's the state doing gas tax collection? Because with electric vehicles, better mileage, I know there's been sort of some gas tax bubbles. I hate to use the term fiscal cliff approaching, but how's the state doing with gas tax collections?
I don't know the specific statistics, but I think it's stable, doing just fine. But you raised the issue of the long term. And there's a legislative task force about transportation funding, and those issues about electric vehicles, have to be looked at, and plans for the future over the next 5, 10, 15 years have to be addressed.
Chris, in corporate governance, you talk about how volatile that is and how difficult it can be to forecast. Looking at year-over-year growth, a year ago we closed the books, I think year-over-year growth was down 20%. This year we're down 21+%. Is that, that's not good. What does that do for budget writers in the future? I mean, it's still $1 billion a year, right?
Right. It is $1 billion out of $22 billion. So putting it in perspective with the sales and income tax, individual income tax, it's not as big a contributor, but it is something that has to be monitored. What we don't know is going into comparison of last year and 2 and 3 years ago, we don't know how much of that tax planning or banking those taxes have gone in, that because of the rebound in the economy after the pandemic, I don't want to call them over collections, but how much did those corporations pay in that now they're sort of adjusting how much they pay in estimated taxes or might be seeking in refunds over time. So that's it. Unlike boxing it in for a single fiscal year, this is a phenomenon that takes place over several years.
What does this mean for the average hero, this report?
Well, I think I'll defer to the comptroller to add any comments here, but I think what I want to convey from our seats is confidence that fiscal responsibility and is paramount to the state of Indiana, and not only the office holders that are represented here, but the governor and the General Assembly take this seriously. And before we spend any money, we ask several questions. How much money actually does need to be raised? And then are we spending it in the best way possible? And so I feel good about the state of Indiana and the discipline that has been maintained over the last couple of decades.
Chris?
Do you want to add anything?
Sure, thank you, Chris. So Indiana hasn't always been in this strong fiscal position. If you remember, goodness, what was it, 25 or so years ago? It was a different story in our state. So we are an example of how to turn things around. Now sitting as the 7th lowest debt per capita state in the nation, having healthy cash reserves, a balanced budget amendment. Indiana is in a strong and exemplary position to lead as a state, and as I mentioned before, with the severity of the national debt crisis that we're facing, it is good for states to make sure that we are maintaining fiscal responsibility here to weather any storms, whether those storms might come in 5 years related to that crisis or 20. We just don't know. But unless they turn that ship around, as Indiana has been turned around, we all need to be prepared for what may be looming ahead, and Indiana is in a very strong fiscal position to do so.
Chris, what advice would you give the next administration on matters fiscal?
Use the data that's there, particularly on spending. The things that, I guess, having seen the amount of money that's come in from the federal government over the last several years, if we've lost the edge on anything, I think it's probably asking the tough questions of, is this the best use of this money? Are we getting the outcomes of which that program was created? So on the spending side, that. As far as on the revenue side, I don't think I have much advice, because I think the track record for the technical committee, and in fact somebody put a spreadsheet together going back, I want to say 15 or 20 years, and the technical committee has landed within 1 to 2% of their forecast, except during the pandemic, every year in the last 20 years. And so I think on the forecasting side, what gets delivered to the General Assembly each December and then updates in April are generally pretty good. And so I think the tools are out there, and it's just, more than anything else, it's just asking the right questions before you make the commitments with the funds.
Now, this report doesn't necessarily take into account the cost-saving measures the FSSA has put in place in the last few months to deal with this Medicaid shortfall. Right. Are there concerns that other programs will essentially meet the same fate as the attendant care program, that other programs will eventually receive a cut in reimbursement? I mean, is that a concern at all? Are you hearing this from the FSSA?
I have not heard that, but I think FSSA is taking a broad look at all of their operations and the impact from on the Medicaid budget. That's part of why they've improved, they're trying and continuing to improve their reporting so that we get more timely information to look at if there are variances, what's causing those variances, and are there mid-year corrections that can be taken instead of waiting for just a formal revenue forecast to come out.
You talked about the outcomes of programming. Are there any any programs that you've noticed that maybe the outcomes aren't what they were intended to be, that maybe, aren't worth the investment?
I'm not going to single any out today, but I think that's always a question that should be asked, and it should be asked on a periodic basis of are we continuing to see the results that we were expecting. In some cases, it's not that you curtail the program. If you see it from a public policy, because there's a group upstairs, right, that make these decisions where to spend the money. But if it's not driving the outcomes, what are you going to do differently to have a better probability of success?
Well, now the question, because even with the estimated forecast, it's still approximately 457 or so million, that still doesn't exactly get to where we need to be to completely get rid of this $1 billion shortfall, right? So why this particular number? What was the justification behind it?
Well, that was the 457 came directly from the last Medicaid forecast. And so looking into the following fiscal year, we do not do what budget people call dynamic scoring to anticipate the results of any corrective action. So going into the next fiscal year, we use the revenue forecast, the Medicaid forecast from last December. Now, this December's forecast, they will take into consideration some of the actions that FSSA has taken and factor that into their forecast. And so I would imagine that 457 is going to be a different number come later this year. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're listening to Indiana Issues. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. So what's been going on with the political news cycle these days? Donald Trump's conviction, Joe Biden's dreadful debate performance, the Trump assassination attempt, Biden dropping out of the race, and who knows what the landscape will look like between now and the time this program is recorded and when it airs. So for all that, we sat down and spoke with our good friend Dr. Laura Albright, assistant professor of political science at the University of Indianapolis. Well, we'd like to check in the world of politics from time to time, but the way the news cycle has been happening lately, everything could change by the time our conversation with our good friend Dr. Laura Wilson is over. She's my colleague at the University of Indianapolis. So, Dr. Wilson, I'd ask you how it's going, but that could all change by the time you answer.
Very true. Right now, I can tell you it's going well, though.
So how would you describe the political landscape these days?
It changed dramatically in the last 2 weeks. First, you had the attempted assassination on former President Donald Trump, an absolute horrific act. We've since seen the director of the Secret Service, after kind of pithy congressional testimony, but taking responsibility for it, right, step down. And then you had current President Joe Biden essentially saying he is dropping out of the race. And by all accounts, it looks like the party will coalesce around Kamala Harris, who's currently serving as vice president. So the ultimate question there, of course, is because he's going to be the new vice president on the Democratic ticket. But it truly is a whirlwind. You're talking about several key events that you sometimes see periodically in an election cycle. And we're talking about seeing 3 in the last 2 weeks of 2024.
And actually, I'll even go a little bit further back. I would say it started technically during when Donald Trump was sentenced, and you had Joe Biden during the debate, and the kind of bad performance there. I mean, you name it, seems like every 20 seconds something changes.
Oh, absolutely. And, I know we'll probably get into polling, and I know you and I both really enjoy looking at those numbers. It feels like it is the up and down of, okay, bad debate performance. Well, it looks like Trump is going to be more successful, right? And then, okay, assassination attempt. Well, that seems like that would favor Trump. Okay, now you have Biden deciding not to run again. That looks like it might favor Harris, the Democrats. It really has been an up and down season. And it's also fascinating because primaries are over. We're not completely to the general election right now because this is convention season. So we've had our state, we had the RNC, we'll be coming up to the DNC. So sometimes we would say that the summer is a low-key time. It's really relaxing, even in terms of politics. Not too much goes on. But yet again, 2024 is proving to buck every trend.
Looking at, like I said, that whole situation, with the president, soon to be outgoing president, decided not to run again. I would argue probably of all the things that have happened so far, like I said in the past 30-something odd days, that had to be the big one, that one right there, that Joe Biden decided he's not going to run again.
I think so, too. And in part because after a truly terrible debate performance back in June, you think about it, Biden had 4 weeks or so to recover, to try to improve how people thought of him and really try to convince folks that he wasn't as old as he looked, that he was in charge, that he was capable of not just finishing out this term, which he still plans on doing, but to be able to serve as the leader of our country for 4 years. And he was never able to pick up that ground. It seems like in the last week, even you heard from Nancy Pelosi and just so many leaders, people high up and generally well-regarded amongst Democrats in the party, either explicitly saying the president should step down or in subtle, low-key, hint, wink, nudge terms suggesting that. I know a lot of times people say oh, well, how does this compare to history? And I'm always quick to say I'm a political scientist, not a historian, but the best example I've seen folks point to, and it's the first one that comes to my mind, is LBJ. And even then, he had competition in the primary, and he dropped out in March when you still had elections going on. So this, when you're talking about just a matter of weeks before the DNC and truly just a few months into the general election, Biden deciding to drop out of the race is absolutely a game changer, I think, especially for the Democrats, but just in general for the electorate. Major change.
Our guest in the program today is our good friend, Dr. Laura Wilson, my colleague at the University of Indianapolis in the Department of Political Science. It's interesting, Laura, that you brought up LBJ, because a lot of people were trying to draw parallels to LBJ deciding not to run again and saying that got Richard Nixon in office. Yeah, but not necessarily, because people forget there was Hubert Humphrey, who was his vice president, but also there was George Wallace, who was running for president as well. So you sort of had that three-person race, and George Wallace was sort of the segregationist in the Democratic stronghold South. I argue that made more of a difference, because I want to say that George Wallace's popular vote was greater than the difference between Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey, if my memory serves me correctly.
Yes, and that is a very important point. It also kind of goes back. So that was 68. Back in 48, where you had Strom Thurmond, again, representing the Solid South, the deviation between the national Democrats. And Wallace was a Democrat, but he didn't look like LBJ or many others within his party. I think, too, if you add into that, 68 was a weird time in politics. I know I keep emphasizing 2024, but you also had RBJ's assassination. Robert Kennedy.
Yeah.
I'm mixing presidents here. You had Robert Kennedy's assassination, and that changed the dynamics there as well. So, and also
don't forget, that's the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated also.
Yes, right. So maybe 2024 isn't quite as tumultuous in terms of politics. I will say I hope nobody is assassinated. There are no more assassination attempts this election cycle, or any, quite frankly, for that matter. But to that point, that comparison, right, it's really hard to say, has this ever happened before? No, not really. We live in historic times, and I know that is super cliche and also redundant, but in this case, I do think it's actually true.
And by the way, also, I think it was interesting that and we'll get to the poll in a little bit later in our conversation, but fundamentally, the polling hasn't really changed all that much. Whether it was Biden, Trump, they're still within the margin of error, and even Harris and Trump, it looks like for the most part, they're still within the margin of error.
They are, and I look at just an accumulation of polls all the time, because that margin of error is really important. Of course, the number that they're including in their sample size, it seems that this is going to be a really tight race, and we may have more debates, and it won't be Biden-Trump this time, right? It'll probably be Harris versus Trump. Certainly we'll have a lot more advertising, a lot more money fundraised and spent, in which both candidates are going to be trying to move that needle either way. But it does look like a very close race. And I think this is great for the American public, but I also think this is really good for all those down ballot races, too. And in every other office where before this change, there were a lot of people that were the double haters that didn't like Biden or Trump. And those are people that might have abstained from voting, right? Not because of any other race. They just didn't like the people that were running for president. And I don't know if they're going to like Harris, but if people are more invigorated and excited in this race, even if it stays close, that might be to its advantage, right? That's going to benefit all the down ballot. And I think that's a really important point, because it's not just a presidential election. It's an entire cycle, and we have so many other key races that voters will be selecting in November.
What does it tell you about the level of energy and enthusiasm? Because it seems like once Joe Biden decided to step out of the race, you had Democrats breathe a big, giant sigh of relief.
It has to feel really bittersweet for him because on one hand, you heard people talking about like, oh, this is, it's acting with integrity and character. And on the other hand, I think you're absolutely right. People did breathe that sigh of relief. So the Democratic Party certainly did. And so if you're Joe Biden, you're like, wow, they really, really not wanted in this position. But I also think that was probably something he was grappling with for a long time. It's not that one particular moment determines a candidacy, but that debate was pretty bad, and there was already concerns about his age, and he'd already served for 4 years. So it seemed very clear for many people in the Democratic Party, this was really a sigh of relief and a moment, I think, again, of invigoration for the party where they're happier with whoever will be leading them on the top of the ticket. And that's going to make a difference, as I'd emphasized, for many races, in addition, of course, to this one.
Our guest on the program today is our good friend, Dr. Laura Wilson, professor of political science, associate professor of political science at the University of Indianapolis. My colleague there, I teach there also. Laura, also something else I thought was interesting, too. People saying that Republicans sort of saying, hey, Joe Biden, should step down from running for election, but he should also step down from the presidency. I'm like, okay, really, guys? Seriously? Come on.
Yeah, the key difference there, I think, is what people are overlooking. So it is one thing to say, I don't want to commit myself to doing this for 4 more years. I don't think I would be the best fit. I might not be able to win, and then I would lose not just the election for myself, but for my party. Very different to say, I have a couple more months. And I think that divergence is really important. That people might be overlooking. I don't think it's unfair to finish out a term and say, I don't want to run again. No, to be fair, in this regard, he didn't make the decision until July, but there's nothing that prevents that from happening in the first place. So I understand. I think especially I've heard it from more conservatives that say, hey, if you're not fit to run again, you shouldn't be still staying in this position. But it is, I think, a key difference because you're talking about a couple months versus a couple years. And it's not just finishing out the term, of course. It's looking ahead to the end game. Would he have been able to win? Would the Democrats have been able to win? That's the part that was looking increasingly less likely with Biden at the top of the ticket.
And what I would argue, too, Laura, is you could run for re-election or you could be president, but in Joe Biden's case, you can't do both, so you got to pick one.
Exactly. And he's already currently president, so that is the easier, more efficient route to take.
And also, too, what I don't understand is, once again, sometimes in politics, people can be too cute by half. For my Republican friends who say Joe Biden should step down, okay, so you want to make Kamala Harris the incumbent then, because she will be president if the current president were to step down.
And that's a great point, too. I think a lot of Republicans will still focus on immigration, and that's certainly going to be a weak point for her. She served as vice president. That hasn't been her primary policy area. Conservatives are very concerned about immigration, So to have her, as you're pointing out, serve, even if for a couple of months, as the incumbent president, will give her a little bit more chops in terms of that policy area and in terms of foreign affairs. It's only a couple months, but it could potentially undermine that argument. Probably not something they'd want to see.
Dr. Laura Wilson, my colleague at the University of Indianapolis, our guest on the program today, as we sort of walk through politics as we sort of walk through politics as they have been as of late, not only in Indiana but here in the country. So, Dr. Wilson, who do you think? Obviously, as we record this conversation, like I said, anything can change between now and when we wrap up here. Obviously, we talked about Beshear, the governor of Kentucky, possibly being a vice presidential candidate. Shapiro of Pennsylvania. I want to say the governor of Minnesota. Also want to say the governor of North Carolina. What do you think Kamala Harris is looking for in a vice presidential pick as we have this conversation, knowing this could all change in 10 minutes?
Exactly. Right. I think in general, and so I don't know if this is specific to Harris, but typically presidents are looking for balance on the ticket, and it doesn't have to be perfect balance. And they're also deeply aware that when you select a vice president, the chief objective is do no wrong. Right? Most voters are not going to be voting for the ticket based on the vice presidential candidate, but if the vice presidential candidate has major liabilities or challenges, if there's concern about whether or not they could hold the office, that old saying, one heartbeat away, and I think that was especially emphasizing concerns about Sarah Palin's credentials in the 2008 presidential election race with McCain and Obama, right? You just want someone who's going to be safe, but also ideally help you. So I would think for Harris, certainly looking at geographic diversity could be helpful. I felt like that was a big win with J.D. Vance selected by Donald Trump. And so finding someone like Shapiro from Pennsylvania, which is an important state in the Electoral College right now, right? I think that would be something you have to add. Bashir coming from Kentucky is at one point blue, now seemingly more conservative state, but he could offer that too. They're also both white men, which would provide a more of a diversity and balance. I think that's essential for Democrats and that party in particular. So thinking about all those things, Harris is interesting because she's probably seen as more conservative based on her background in terms of attorney general and prosecution. So if she's seen like that, she might want to consider someone maybe more left-leaning. But I don't know that when you're talking about the landscape of American politics right now, she's not running in a primary anymore. She was in 2020, right? I don't know that you need to go necessarily more left. If I'm thinking like she might be, I would say look at geographic diversity, look at a balance of the ticket. And the key in this election cycle, and it has been for several successive election cycles, is not going to be like get everyone from your party, right? It is get the independents, get the moderates, for Harris, looking at the groups that Biden was starting to lose with and Trump was starting to gain with, African-American voters, Hispanic voters, Gen Z, and younger voters, right? Trying to capture them and see if Harris herself can't do that, who's the vice presidential pick, who is the person that might be able to help. That would probably be the key in terms of that strategy, identifying that individual.
And on the flip side of that, like I said, Donald Trump picked J.D. Vance, senator from Ohio, to be his running mate. I'm trying to see what J.D. Vance brings to the table, because obviously this race is going to be fought in the middle like most elections are. And J.D. Vance can maybe sort of shore up your base a bit, but I've been trying to make the dots like, hey, what does J.D. Vance do to attract those middle-of-the-road, independent, moderate voters?
I think he offers a couple key things. So he had been involved in Silicon Valley. He'd done investment. He had gone to an Ivy League school. So he's educated. He has pedigree. That's going to appeal to some, not to all. And also, as a famous author writing Hillbilly Elegy, brands himself as Appalachian, as working class, as coming from that sort of background. I think he provides more of a neutral balance, though he himself is fairly conservative, and Donald Trump has been inconsistent. Sounds unfair, but I don't think he's necessarily been conservative on a degree of issues.
I tell people Donald Trump is always consistent because Donald Trump is looking after Donald Trump, period.
Yes, and I think if you don't like him, you're likely to be like, oh no, he's really conservative. I'm like, well, no, not necessarily. There's some policies where he's very moderate, but I see Vance as providing like that solid, kind of like Mike Pence, right? That solid foundation and grounding. He's someone that you can trust. Vance is obviously much younger, and that probably helps. Now Donald Trump is the older candidate in the race, now that Joe Biden isn't. So I think I can see how those components would be really appealing. Now, I wonder, he didn't choose Marco Rubio, and especially I mentioned those Hispanic voters, right? That would have kind of been an olive branch and reaching out in that direction. And I'm not exactly sure why, but J.D. Vance has been an up-and-comer in American politics. Obviously, this is going to make him kind of solidified in that perspective. But I think it was a balance, and I thought a wise decision strategically for the party.
So, by the way, I got to ask, what do you think about the third parties, whether it is the Libertarian, RFK, who looks like he's going to be on the ballot in some places, Jill Stein maybe, with people sort of just ticked off at Republicans and Democrats, do third parties this year actually have a better shot than usual?
They did until this changed, and I have not seen any polling. Of course, this happened just a matter of days ago, right? But with the change at the top of the ticket with Harris, I don't know how it impacts those third-party candidacies. traditionally, those double haters, if they choose to participate and vote, that is where you have a real opportunity with third parties. And I know a lot of times people like to frame them as spoilers. I think that's incredibly unfair, but also it's a misunderstanding, right? For voters that select a third-party candidate, they're recognizing what the parties have to offer, what their policies are, and what their candidates stand for, and they're identifying which one works best for them. So I think when we're looking at that, this was going to be a really good year for third parties. I don't know now with Biden out and Harris in, if they still have the same fortune and chance, right? I wonder if it might decline slightly because of those, the double haters, so to speak. But it's early to say, so I'm not quite sure yet exactly how that'll pan out. It certainly was an opportunity for third parties. This election cycle may or may not still be one, though.
Dr. Laura Wilson, University of Indianapolis, on the program today as we sort of look at the state of our politics, even though it could change every 5 seconds. Dr. Wilson, let's change gears a little bit, look sort of things statewide. This month we just wrapped up both the Democrat and Republican state conventions. You had Mike Braun. He picked Julie McGuire, but the delegates chose Micah Beckwith. On the Democrat side, you had Jennifer McCormick and Terry Gooden. Your thoughts on those picks and how those conventions how the ticket sort of set itself up?
Right. The Republican convention was really interesting because that was an example where we're reminded that delegates have the power, not the candidate selected in the primary. And I think in some ways it's very powerful for the delegates to say, oh, we recognize that Mike Braun would prefer McGuire, but in fact, we prefer Beckwith. But it tells us a couple of things. First of all, Beckwith led a very unique, I can't think of another time you had a candidate running for lieutenant governor, so a really unique approach, and he was successful. So we might be seeing other folks follow this pathway forward in the future. It also shows that I think the party has a lot of diversity within it, and people don't just yield. Sometimes we make that assumption, right? But they're not just going to yield, okay, yes, this is what the candidate would prefer. But when we're looking at the balance of things or what our party represents, a majority of delegates disagreed. And ultimately sided with Beckwith over McGuire. So that's the balance. That's the ticket that you'll have set up for the Republicans. I think when you're looking at McCormick and Gooden, and there were other candidates running for lieutenant governor, Gooden won it quite easily. To me, there does seem like, again, I'd emphasize the word balance there, arguably more so than the Republican ticket for governor and lieutenant governor. But you're talking about generally two fairly moderate candidates. You have a balance in terms of agricultural background with Gooden, right? That's his area of expertise, and he's served in state-level government for a very long time. McCormick had been involved in state-level government, too, serving under education back when it was a superintendent of public instruction, so she has that background. And when you're thinking of agriculture and education, those are two really important statewide issues. So I think that's a marriage of two policy areas the Democrats are hoping to bring together and emphasize through that candidacy.
Well, something I thought was really interesting about both the Democrat and state convention, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, was on the Republican side, you have a Republican who used to be a Democrat, and on the Democrat side, you have a Democrat who used to be a Republican because of the primary. You had a Republican who picked a lieutenant governor candidate, who the Republicans had a lieutenant governor candidate that the moderates couldn't stand, and the Democrats end up with a lieutenant governor that the progressives couldn't stand. Welcome to 2024.
Exactly. It should reemphasize, right? Even though we think of parties as being very concrete, right? Parties change, and so do people, so do policies, so do issues and stances. I think also to that point, it is something I like to emphasize so much because you see it highlighted in primaries and conventions, right? We have a predominantly two-party system, but that is a fallacy in terms of how Americans identify because we're not just red and blue. There's so much diversity represented within the political parties. And I personally love seeing when that diversity is highlighted, oftentimes in terms of conflict. But it is the balance, right? You're going to have, as you said, more progressives in the liberal part and underneath Democrats, and then you'll have some more moderates there. And same thing for Republicans, where you'll have more conservative and maybe more focused on fiscal issues versus social issues. That's normal. I think that's actually very healthy for a democracy. You will ultimately not get everything you want all the time, But that also, quite frankly, to me sounds like a democracy too. So you're absolutely right. That is welcome to 2024 and a really good reminder of the way parties operate, sometimes successfully, sometimes with challenges, maybe even failures, but how they operate in our country.
Dr. Laura Wilson with us for a few more minutes on the program today as we sort of look at the past month or so in state and national politics. Dr. Wilson, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Indiana is kind of a weird state in the sense that the Republican candidate is picked through a primary system, whereas the lieutenant governor is picked during a convention. And 9 out of 10 times the governor gets who the governor wants, but you have situations like this where we had Micah Beckwith winning with the delegates. Is it time, first of all, your thoughts on the current system of how we pick the governor, lieutenant governor, and is it time to pick them both the same way, either in a primary or a convention? Now, full disclosure, I prefer conventions because primaries are a political function. I don't see why the government should have to pay for parties to pick their candidates, but that's just me thinking out loud.
I think there's advantages and disadvantages to both, and that's kind of my cheap and easy way of skirting my own opinion on it, in part because I don't necessarily have one. Right? I like primaries and giving voters a say of who represents their party, and I recognize there are a number of loopholes within that statement because you don't necessarily have to be a member of the party to vote for that party, and there's all sorts of challenges there. But I do think providing voters that opportunity, and certainly when the governor will be top of ticket in terms of statewide offices, the chief executive for the state, the face and name that people associate with this state, there's a lot more in terms of responsibility and power that's associated with that office. Now, there are states where you elect your lieutenant governor in a primary, and they're not even on the same ticket, right? They're separate. You could have a combination Republican-Democrat or Democrat-Republican. I think the benefit of providing that office, giving that decision to the delegates, confirms that it's the party, and dare I say elite, right? But the true partisans, the people that are deeply involved and dedicated in the party, making that selection. To me, it actually feels like a balance, maybe it's the compromise, right? Where you have the party making one decision and then voters who associate with the party making the other. But I would say if people were feeling very strongly one way or the other, the best part about American government is that there are 49 other states out there, and some do their elections very similarly to ours, but there are many states that have them in a different organization. I would encourage looking at that and saying, okay, so if I think that just doing conventions would be better, right? What do those states look like? What are the outcomes of the candidates that win? What are things that are good about this and what are things that are bad, or vice versa? But that's the really nice thing about state government is that we can make those comparisons. And if people agree that ultimately what we're doing isn't working for us, right, we could suggest, promote, and it's possible, of course, always change the policy so we do something different.
Okay, so here's my final question for you then, because you set this up perfectly. If you prefer primaries, do you prefer an open primary, a closed primary, ranked choice voting? If we're going to, because once again, I don't believe that the taxpayers should foot the bill for political parties to pick their candidates. But if they are, then it should be an open system. Top two vote getters. If no one gets under 50%, you get over 60, you automatically won.
You know what? I will say just because I enjoy chaos, I think open primaries are pretty fun. I don't know if they're the most democratic, right? Lowercase d, not the party, but just being fair. Because when you have an open party, of course, folks can pick and choose and say, oh, there's lots of competition in this one, and there's no competition in that one. I'm going to go for this one, even if they don't associate, identify, affiliate with that political party. So, again, kind of cheap and easy answer. I like open primaries because of the chaos that they can provide. But I think also they do allow for a lot more voter participation. I'm not sure they're necessarily best for democracy, though.
So what advice do you have for the folks who are listening who aren't as entrenched in all this stuff as us political geeks are?
Oh, it's never too late to start paying attention. And I'm so glad you asked that question, Abdul, because I remember when I was watching politics unfold, maybe in high school, I felt like there were so many people who knew more than I did and, lived and breathed it. And I was interested in high school, but I didn't. It's never too late at any age, at any time. Just starting to pick up on things like, hey, if you were paying attention to politics a week ago, we had a different presidential candidate leading the Democratic ticket. So you're not behind. You can just start paying attention. And of course, we are just a couple months away from the election, so there's never been a better time. to start educating yourself and becoming informed on these major issues.
All right. Well, our guest on the program today has been our good friend, my colleague, Dr. Laura Wilson at the University of Indianapolis, sort of doing a lay of the landscape on the 2024 election. But please know, folks, all this could change within a millisecond. So, Dr. Laura Wilson, my dear, thank you very much for chatting with me. Always love talking to you.
Always my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Abdul.
And that will do it for this edition of Indiana Issues. As always, you can catch us throughout the week at our parent website, IndyPolitics.org. And be sure to catch a new version of Indiana Issues television program. You can find us on Comcast as well as YouTube and Facebook. Indiana Issues is underwritten in part by the Indiana Conference of Mayors, our Trust Local program, the Indiana Chamber of Commerce, the Small Business Law Firm of Thrasher, Bushman & Volkel, the Indiana Civil Rights Commission, and Downtown Comics, your place to escape. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazz. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time on Indiana Issues.